Okay, honey, are you going to tell me about what what life was after New York?
What life was after New York?
Yeah. Well, what happened just before you
Well,
left New York?
well, I left New York twice.
Twice?
Yeah. I had gone there in February of '67, and all those things happened that I told you about, the acid trips and um, living with friends on the Lower East Side of New York. And I actually got a job. I mean, we did a lot of drugs and we were selling drugs, but I actually got a job on Madison Avenue. I was working in an advertising company, like the show Mad Men, except I was their token hippie. So I'd come to work with, and they'd show their clients and say, "See how chic we are? We got a hippie working here." But
Do you remember the job interview?
Well, actually, it was the one nice thing my mother did for me. She gave me the name of a man she knew in New York. She had come to see me at the Plaza Hotel in New York, which was a really fancy hotel, and I went in with my Nehru shirt, and I went in there barefoot, and you don't do that at the Plaza. But she gave me the name of a man, and I talked to the man, and they had a job for me, and so I did it. So I'd go from the Lower East Side to my job in advertising. But meantime, I'd had this spiritual awakening. I knew there was more to life than just, working a job, But New York was getting pretty crazy for me because I was doing too many drugs. And I actually left the advertising agency. I left a note on the Xerox machine that said, "Shelley," that was my boss, "Shelley, I'm hallucinating so much I can't read my charts. I have to take a break from this." And I left and I went,
How old were you?
this would have been 19. I would have been 19 years old. And I left and I went to my friend Steve, and we'd both been talking about leaving. This was in '67, yeah. And so we hitchhiked. We left New York and we hitchhiked. We were going to hitchhike back to Chicago because that was his home. And we hitchhiked into Michigan, and we were hippies, long hair, beards, and stuff like that. And we were going through, I don't know what it was, cutting through Michigan. I can't remember if it's Route 80 or whatever. You have to go down around Illinois. But anyway, we were hitchhiking through Michigan, and these state cops ran us off the highway and made us walk to the nearest town. It was like 5 or 6 miles away. So we walked north to this town. This was on a Saturday night, and we became the Saturday night date at the town because we ended up on the strip of the town, where there were drive-ins and everything.
Main Street.
So yeah, so all the kids from the high school would come and be pointing at the hippies and stuff. And then Steve and I slept under a trailer that night. And it was raining, and he caught pneumonia. And I finally called my aunt and uncle in Washington, D.C., and I said, "Can you spot us bus money to get us into Chicago?" And they said, "Yes, we will, if you come back to Washington, D.C. and spend some time with us." These were my most nurturing relatives, So I thought, wow, I can do that. So that's what happened. Then I went back to Washington, D.C. But my uncle, who was a really nice guy and a lawyer at the National Labor Relations Board, wanted me to get work. And I was still in the, the kind of hippie idea of I didn't want to just do a regular job, and he got me a job at the Pottery Barn. What's going on?
Go ahead, honey.
What are they doing? Are they coming down or not?
So the pot,
Stop their crying. I don't know what's on and what's off. I heard a noise behind me, and then it looked like you were stopping. And this is way. So I got a job at the Pottery Barn that lasted one day.
What did you do at the Pottery Barn?
I did nothing because I only lasted 3 hours. What I did was I learned what a really fucking boring job this was going to be, and there was no way I was going to spend even a small portion of my life doing it. So yeah, I left, and then my uncle and I wanted to go back to New York and give it another shot. So I went back to New York in January of 1968, and actually, the funny part was I went back to New York. I found another apartment. Jim Wells, who you know, was moving out of an apartment he had.
Mm.
I had been at 5th and C, and this was at 7th and C. So, and it was a nice apartment. And this was, yeah, it would have been the very beginning of 1968, the end of 1967. So I'd been in D.C. for about 3 months, maybe 2. Went back to New York. Went back to the people who I quit the job on, and they hired me back. I couldn't believe it. They hired me back at a higher rate of pay because they still needed the token hippie or whatever. And I actually did good work for them there. We were supposed to judge why commercials were effective or why they weren't. So I'd get really high and then watch the commercial and I'd just go, oh wow, that's obvious why that's bad. And then, but we tested it in front of people, so their results would come back and I would match their results with my own thinking on the commercial and I would write why it was a good or bad commercial.
Mm.
So anyway, they took me back. The funny part was they didn't have an office for me. So I'll be damned if they didn't give me a corner office that a vice president had just let go of. And if you've ever seen Mad Men, where they had the 2 windows coming together and they could see the city, that was my office.
Oh,
you can ask Gene. That was my office. I had a desk, I had a sofa, and I was just this hippie off the street. And Gene would come up, and friends would come up, and we'd all get high in my office over the lunch hour. And I actually had a secretary, an English girl named Anna, and she and her boyfriend, who was smuggling hash into the country, came and lived at the commune that I then started up at 7th and C. And it was a commune that got to be about, at one point there were 10 or 12 people living there.
Hmm.
And Blood, Sweat and Tears, the band, practiced next door before they hit it big. So that was an interesting time in New York, and Steve wasn't there for this time, so I was kind of making my own way. But in that space of that 6 or 7 months, everything started to change. Charlie Manson happened.
Yeah.
You know. And I just realized that this is getting way out of control. The commune part was getting way out of control. And
How old were you at that point?
well, this would have been 1968, so I would have just turned 20. I would have just turned 20. And Jean came up, and she lived in the commune for a little bit, you know, and all kinds of people were in and out of this place over 5 or 6 months. Somewhere along the line, I got another. I left New York when I moved out of the East Village. I can't remember why, but I moved into an apartment on West 81st Street near Columbus Circle, which is a whole world away, and it wasn't the West Village. And it was. Now it's an up-and-coming area. Back then it was questionable. Well, so was the East Village, you know, in terms of safety and stuff like that. So I lived there, and I don't have much memory of living there. I think because, again, I was still doing quite a bit of drugs, and I was doing this work. And I decided nobody was there in New York. I just didn't really know anybody. A lot of my friends had left. Even Gene had gone back to Washington, D.C., and I thought, well, I have to leave New York. I just can't make it here. You know, they say if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere.
Right.
It's really true. And I was a stoned hippie, I mean, out of the Midwest, and I was not in any shape to conquer New York, as it were. So I left New York. And I left New York, I'll always remember, on the day that Bobby Kennedy was shot in Los Angeles. I think it was June 5th, 1968. And I went back to Chicago, actually lived in another old apartment of Jim Wells in Evanston, got in touch with my mother, who was in Chicago doing her business, and she put me in touch with somebody who gave me a job with her little marketing firm or whatever. And that summer, I just went through a lot of stuff, you know, about my own drug use and how much my own life had run down. I was still really freaked out because I think I mentioned before I'd never been laid, and it was really getting to me.
Was that mainly on your mind?
What?
Was it mainly on your mind?
It wasn't mainly, but the whole nature of love and sex, which has been a recurring theme for me throughout my
And
life.
that whole year of 1968 was the year of love, so...
Well, it may be the year of love, but it wasn't for me. I actually had two girls ask me, in those days the euphemism was, "Do you want a ball? Do you want to go to bed?" And I turned them down because I thought I had to have a feeling of love for them, and I didn't. As horny as I was.
The way
Strange,
that history is
Yeah.
that love was the big theme of 1968. So no wonder love and sex would be on everybody's mind, and
Yeah.
what everybody truly understood about it would have been on everybody's mind.
Right, but for me it was still that ongoing question because of my father's homosexuality and not really having experienced love myself as when I was a younger person. The closest person I ever came close to feeling love from was my aunt,
Right.
Gretchen. My uncle was a great guy, but he was like me. He was pretty introverted and closed off. It's like you could tell they love you, but they never say it or they never show it, But that was the only experience that I'd had. So I was caught up in my own personal quandaries. And also, along the way, this whole thing, which is really most important, is I was looking for a spiritual teaching. I never forgot the lessons of that acid trip. I never forgot the lessons of being interconnected. But the more I saw it, the more I felt like I was losing all connection with the world around me. I really didn't care very much about anything.
Could have been the drug use.
It could have been the drug use. It could have been my natural dysthymia, but at that point, depression. I would certainly think about killing myself, even though I never tried to again after those experiences on the bad acid. I was suicidal. And part of me, I had a really good friend named Marty Hurd, now dead, and his brother dead too, and he was the sweetest man I've probably ever known, and he was a heroin addict. And he was making heroin addiction look very attractive to me, even though I never did more than really snort it, and I liked it. But I knew it was the opposite direction from where I wanted to go. I knew it was going to close me off instead of open me up to, as Aldous Huxley would say, the doors of perception, to a higher consciousness. So it was against that backdrop then that I left New York on the day Bobby Kennedy was shot, went to Chicago, had a miserable 3 months in Chicago, which included those events with those women that wanted to go to bed with me. I turned them down because of my crazy notion that somehow I was supposed to be in love with them before we went to bed. That's
I
what I
don't
actually
think it's
thought.
crazy to think that, especially in the 60s.
Well, it may not have been, but they weren't interested. They just got tired of waiting for me and said, "Oh, forget it," So that never happened. So I was still a virgin, and that really, really bothered me. And my friend Gene, who I'd met up in New York, said, "You've got to come to Washington, D.C. You've got to come back to Washington. I've discovered this thing, and I've got to tell it to you." Well, what is it? Well, it'll sound silly over the phone. You just have to come back, and I'll tell you all about it. So, and she told me the Buddhist chant, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. So I was down on Lake Michigan on the beach, and I was really depressed. It was almost like one of those "A Star Is Born" moment where I was considering walking into the surf and drowning myself or something. I was down there with my dog Lump. And it started to kind of thunder and lightning. And Lump, who was my steadfast companion and had been for 2 years, I don't know if I hallucinated or if it really happened, but he lunged at me kind of snarling and trying to bite me. Well, he never did that. He was the world's most passive dog. So that happened, and it was thundering, and I was just thinking, I just got to end it all. And so I remembered the words that Gene had told me, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, and I chanted them. And Lump backed off, and the storm came to an end, and the dawn began to break. And I thought, that's really pretty amazing, and so within a week I was on my way back to Washington, D.C., not to practice Buddhism or chant, but just to see my friend Gene, because I was looking at it as some kind of cosmic message. And so I got back to Washington, D.C., and that's when I started to learn about Buddhism. That would have been in September of 1968. This whole thing, this whole depression and everything, that was a huge part of it too. I'm forgetting that part. This was all taking place against the backdrop of the Chicago 1968 Democratic Convention, where hippies and yippies, because that was the militant faction of the hippies, had inspired the ire of Mayor Daley and the Chicago police force. So they were getting beaten up and things in the streets.
Right.
And they weren't really friends of mine, but I thought, man, this is just the end of the movement. This is how it ends, kind of with a whimper. The whole tune in, drop out, we're going to change America thing just kind of died during the Chicago, 1968 convention, which was a convention that I think nominated, was it Hubert Humphrey? I can't remember.
He was the vice.
It may have
the
been
vice.
George McGovern,
Yeah.
who lost, of course, to Richard Nixon, and then we entered this terrible political phase that we've been in for 37 years.
Shut the door.
So
That was 1968.
this all happened in 1968, but what I'm saying is all the depression I was going through, everything was in that summer of 68. I had just never ever been that down. So for Gene to call me and say I found this great thing, I was prime. I was prime for anything. Yeah, I want to see Gene again anyway. So that's why I went to Washington D.C. But literally, I went to Washington D.C. about 2 weeks after that convention. Strangely, Jim Wells, went there 2 weeks before me because I had somehow talked to him. He'd never really spent any time in D.C. So he took my dog Lump, because I was disenchanted with Lump anyway since he got mad at me on the beach. So Jimmy took Lump in his Volkswagen bus,
Yeah.
and he drove off to Washington, D.C., and I ended up there about 3 weeks later, September of 68.
So y'all met up in Washington, D.C.
We all met up in Washington, D.C. We all lived together in Washington, D.C. at a variety of homes for, probably 6 or 8 months. Gene and myself, and Jimmy was there, and the Bennett twins, and and there were just a bunch of us, and we lived in this apartment.
So you knew Donna before.
No, I didn't know Donna before. I met her. She was the only person I knew were Jimmy and Gene. No, I didn't know anybody else. These were all people I met when I got to Washington.
But you knew Donna before you were proposed to marry.
Yeah, so I was, and this was nice, kind of meandering. Because I'm wearing my holiday shirt.
Holiday at Central Minnesota.
Yeah.
Well, I know you're tired, so I will let you be. So you and Jim Wells and Gene Rosenberg all lived in where? Washington?
We all lived in Washington, D.C.
Together.
Yeah, first we had this, Gene, and I don't even remember, but Gene somehow had this luxury apartment on Connecticut Avenue. And they just moved in, and we only lasted there 2 weeks because we ended up having a party where some of us were sitting on the windowsills, dangling our feet out the window, and this was like 6 floors up, and the apartment owners didn't like that, so they kicked us out. Then we lived in a big haunted Russian house type place for several months, and then we lived, boy, I can't remember, lived at 23rd and M. That may have been the first place we lived. 23rd and M was a second floor apartment over a bodega, a Mexican-owned grocery store.
So when you went to Washington, is that when Gene had introduced you to Buddhism?
Gene said, come to Washington, I want to tell you about this amazing thing I'm in. She didn't even call it Buddhism.
Did she take days to tell you?
No,
Months?
no, she hit me with it as soon as I got there.
Okay.
And they tried to get me to chant, and I would chant a little bit, but I just thought it was alien and weird as hell, and I'd already been through the Hare Krishna thing. I'd already been with the various Om, Mani Padme. There's lots of chants I had tried. They all felt nice. They induced meditative states. I didn't spend money on transcendental meditation, but I really didn't have much use in my life for a chant.
Right.
But they would say in those days, and it was part right and part wrong, if you chant these words within 3 months, you'll get whatever you want. You'll get whatever you're chanting for,
All right, now, I know that...
But I was very skeptical, and they said, well, you have to come to this meeting next week. You have to come to a meeting and talk to this man, and we think he'll convince you. This was mostly Jean telling me this. And her friends, the twins, Bonnie and Donna.
I know you're very, very tired, and you may not show it because you're a handsome guy on the video, but Can we say good night?
Yeah, we can say good night.
Okay.
Good night, sweetie.
Good night.
That's what you wanted. We didn't do that in the other one.